Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. How are you today?
Good, alhamdulillah, for the most part.
For the most part. Okay.
We have to pace ourselves.
Okay.
And you?
I'm great. Shukran, alhamdulillah.
It's good.
What are we talking about today again?
We're talking about something that comes up far too often, but is also far too often misunderstood.
Okay.
Navigating divorce.
Okay.
Yes. And the strange part about all of this is that we're not just going to be talking about divorce and what happens with the impact of divorce.
Okay.
Because I honestly believe that more often than not, divorce is considered as an option to solve the wrong problem.
Because what are you trying to solve?
Yes, what's the
You
real
converted
problem?
me.
What's the real problem we're trying to solve? And more often than not, we're so distracted by what it is that we think the problem is that we automatically assume that the solution must be something that is as grave and decisive as the size of the problem that we think we're dealing with.
Mhm. So, and I may be a novice in this regard, so do excuse me, because I've never been divorced.
We won't talk
divorced.
about the fact that I'm a veteran, but anyway.
Alhamdulillah. So what I lack in experience, you more than make up for. Right?
Yes, all the way. I'm more concerned about how it is that often I'm approached by people saying that, well, I've made up my mind, I want a divorce, and you need to help us to navigate this so that we can reduce the impact on the kids. We need to consider how the families are going to be impacted by this, or I need to know how I'm going to deal with the after effects of this and move on with my life and all of those sorts of things. All very valid concerns. But again, what's the problem we're trying to solve?
Yeah, so for me, what really in my exposure to divorce has obviously been through clients, right? And family members, of course, is the part that really, I'll say, scares me is, yes, divorce is an option, but how many people see it as the only option?
Yes.
And for me, that's really because I often see people then, because you get into a space where you can't see the wood for the trees, right? You're just in this rut where you're just nothing you're trying because there's so much antagonism, and we kind of touched in it at the middle of our second patriarchy episode, where it's about significance,
Yes.
and people not literally taking a step back and understanding their humanness
Yes.
in this whole thing.
But also, just on that point, sorry to interrupt you, is that when we talk about significance, often we don't realize that we're actually struggling for significance.
Yes.
But we automatically focus on what is the issue at hand. Why am I not being taken seriously? Why is my needs not being respected? Meanwhile, all of that is underpinned by our need to be significant to our significant other.
That's it. And so many times I've seen people are in that rut, they can't see the wood for the trees, and they're like, this is the only way to go, and they drive the relationship to its illogical end,
Yes.
in my view, I'm not saying divorce is always illogical, but sometimes it is, because then they go down the divorce route. So they either have the first talaq, the second talaq, and then something changes.
Yes.
And then they're left in, some people are left in a situation where they've gone the full thing. Now, Islam doesn't make it so easy for you to just get back together again. And then there's so many regrets.
And so many loopholes that you start searching for, because then you want to pay someone to be able to marry your ex-partner so that and then divorce them so they can become halal for you. And now we start compromising what we've already compromised significantly about ourselves and about our iman, right?
Yeah.
But we're not here about what's right and what's wrong, because that is clear. I come back to my question about what is the problem we're trying to solve, and to answer that question, we need to ask ourselves, what is that we're really dealing with when we get to the point where we say, enough is enough, I want out. Because apart from the fact that underpinning all of it is that there's a serious lack of a sense of significance to each other from both parties when you get to the point of divorce.
Mm-hmm.
We also don't realize that if we're arguing and fighting all the time, then is that a good enough reason for divorce? If we have what we nowadays would want to call an abusive relationship, either emotionally abusive or financially abusive and all of that, is divorce going to remedy that, right? Because what are we trying to fix?
Yes.
So rather than focusing on what is it that got you to the point of wanting the divorce, we focus on irreconcilable differences. We need to go our own way, and that's it. Now that has its place as well. That's why Islam allows for divorce, because there is a point that you can get to where it's, what's the word, intractable, to the point where you just have to accept that two parties are not trying to create the same outcome any longer.
Yeah. So
that's the problem.
So what I'd like for us to maybe explore, because I see two different scenarios here, right? I see a situation where, can we speak about, we've got to this point and actually maybe divorce is not the right thing, and how do we move forward? Or we've got to this point and actually sometimes divorce is the right thing.
Yes.
Right? So maybe if we can start chatting about those two scenarios at the point, at that precipice of, do we get divorced or not?
So when divorce is an option, becomes an easier one to discuss and consider is when there are no children involved, right? Because then to make a clean break is a lot easier, and I said clean break with reservation. It's a lot easier because it's less complicated. You don't have to worry about custody, you don't have to worry about the impact on the kids, you don't have to worry about co-parenting and all of those other things, right? Now, what we don't realize though is that if you get to that point and you don't have children, alhamdulillah for that, less impact on others. But if you get to that point and you agree that you're going to divorce, but you still don't resolve what got you to that point of divorce, I'm not saying it might, I'm saying it absolutely will recreate itself in your next relationship.
Yes, because you're not fixing what led you to that point.
Yes.
And it is, what are you trying to solve? What are you looking for? So, are you just wanting to get away from each other because you work on each other's nerves so much?
Yeah.
Right? Or are you fighting for something more significant? And I think maybe, crucial conversations are important to discuss here, because sometimes if you just sat and had enough willpower or enough energy,
yeah,
at that point I can imagine, and I'm saying imagine because I've never been there, right? At that point, if you probably are so tired, and the story you're telling yourself is a really tragic one, and
yes.
It has to come to this end. But if you really, really just sat and sense checked everything, to almost just say, is this a checklist just to see?
Right.
Yeah.
But you're raising a very important point. Because usually by the time we get to the question of it's time for a divorce, there's a few critical assumptions we're making. The one assumption we're making is that everything we know about it is all there is to know about it. The situation is we currently experience it, that we've been through all the scenarios, we've tried everything, we've had all the counseling, all the advisors, all the therapy and everything else, and we're just not compatible. That's what we like to believe, right? But you're compatible enough to commit to marriage in the first place. So what we need to understand is, what did we lose from the point of that compatibility that gave us reason to believe we could make a life together, to get to this point saying, well, no, well, obviously I didn't know you. Isn't that true for both sides then, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't understand what it is that you're actually dealing with that's causing the contention, you automatically going to look at divorce for the wrong reason. Now, I completely lost my train of thought. What was I saying?
I think that train left a long time ago.
Didn't even get to the station. So the assumption that we make is that everything about the situation is everything that needs to be known about it. That we have 100% clear understanding of it, and that everything we've considered as far as remedies are concerned is fully informed. That's where we go wrong. Because what we need to understand is that if we're still experiencing the point of contention, and that point of contention is one that is filled with emotion, it's filled with antagonism, it's filled with tit for tat and those sorts of things, then chances are you still, not chances are, in fact, I can quite confidently say, you still don't understand what's really driving the disagreement or the contention that exists in the relationship. Which brings me to the next important point, which is, if that is where you're at and that's why you want to get divorced, you need to understand that up until that point, all the advisors, all the counseling, the therapy, and all the assumptions and the observations you've made about it is incomplete. There is an angle to this that you are missing, and you need to keep searching for that angle so that you either get resolution and you avoid the divorce, or if you're going to go through with the divorce, you get resolution to a point where you're leaving for the right reason, because you don't want that to become another problem again in your next relationship.
You hit on such a crucial point there. And for me, that is never shut down the possibility to introduce new information into a situation.
Yes.
Because with things as serious as this, you need to make sure you're making really informed decisions.
Yeah.
And if you shut yourself out, shut or down to the possibility of there may be new information that is relevant to help frame the situation, and I'm not saying frame the situation so that we don't get divorced, but also maybe frame the situation that just acknowledges or verifies
Yes.
why we need to get divorced.
Yes. Understand that divorce is the answer to the right question.
Okay.
Right? That's what we need to be sure. We need to be sure that when we're pursuing divorce as the option, that it's going to solve the right problem. Otherwise, we trying to get a solution B to solve problem A, and guess what? You'll have a solution, you'll create distance, you might have a bit more peace in your immediate surrounding, but the problem that got you to that point is still there.
Absolutely. So for me, I love the thing of asking the right. We often don't ask the right questions in any situation.
Yes.
What could be some of the wrong questions we're asking when we get to that point?
When you get to that point, the wrong questions to ask is, what's in it for me? Why am I not getting what I need? Why is it that I'm not respected? All of these things that focuses on why am I affected by this as much as I am. You see? Because there's a piece of advice I always like to give newlyweds. And that is that when you get to a point of disagreement or you're experiencing difficulty in your relationship, who do you speak to? Do you speak to the person or the support structure that knows your partner well, or do you speak to your support structure that knows you well? What problem are you trying to solve? If you're trying to solve a problem of creating more understanding of who your partner is and what drives them to behave the way they do, then you need to speak to their family, not your family.
Yo, that sounds like you're opening up a whole can of worms. I mean, what happens to people who don't have great relationships with their in-laws and who just want to feast over that? So imagine if I have awful in-laws and I go and I say to them, look, I'm having issues with my husband and I want to just understand him a bit more, and they were like, yeah, and they just manipulate it because of their own bias. I'd be scared to do that, quite frankly.
True. However, if that is a concern at that point in your relationship, then you've got more than just your understanding with your partner that you have to resolve, because now you need to understand why it is that your relationship with your in-laws are strained. And I'm not for 1 second placing all the onus on the person who is at a point where they've just had enough, they can't accept it anymore. But what I'm saying is that when we try to understand why we got to that point, we must truly try to understand. We mustn't look for a point system. I've done all of this and he doesn't do that. I've done all of this and she doesn't do that, right? Because now we're transacting again, and transacting never goes well.
Yeah. So I take a lot of guidance from that. In my marriage, personally, it can get to a point. Nobody's marriage is easy, right? So it does get to a point where you think, in a minute, I'm just going to walk out, right? But the thing is that when you start wanting to assign blame, and you start wanting to make yourself feel better because you want to be the victim in the marriage, right? You don't want to be the villain. And the mere fact that we do that, the minute you put yourself into a victim mode, automatically by default, whether the other person is the best human or not, they become the villain, because that's just how victim-villain mentality works.
Yes.
right? So even if that person is really awesome, you will then start manufacturing things in your mind to say this is why that person's a villain.
Yes. And if you don't manufacture something in your mind for it, what you will do is you'll discard all the information that confirms that they're actually good because you're looking to prove that they're bad.
Yes.
Right? And that is something we need to be critical about because we do that not only with others, we do it with ourselves. If you're convinced that your self-worth is low, that your value to others is low, then you're going to look for evidence to confirm why it is that they don't value you.
Yes.
Because if that's your insecurity and you don't want anyone else to know about it, but you use that as your barrier between yourself and others, then automatically you're going to look for the evidence that confirms that yes, I am not good enough.
Now there's a fine line between this, right?
There's a lot of fine lines around here.
What happens if I am being so badly abused and it really gets to the point where actually divorce is the way to go?
Right. Divorce is the way to go if you've already exhausted all avenues to try to understand why the abuse is there in the first place. Now, I'm not suggesting that anyone should tolerate the abuse for a given period of time before you decide it's enough is enough. But exactly the same thing again. What problem are you trying to solve when you get into that abusive kind of situation in a relationship? Because more often than not, and I know there are incidents where immediately after the nikah is confirmed and the couple start out as a married couple, that you see shifts in the dynamics already. And then it could quite easily be seen as, okay, it's already controlling, it's already abusive in different ways, and it just spirals from there. In those cases, you need to seriously reconsider what it is that you thought was true versus what you're seeing to be true, and then have competent advisors who can give you a balanced view about whether you imagining things or is there truth to what it is that you're seeing is the differences now, right? But when it comes back to the abuse issue, the first time that you experience something that is abusive from your partner, you need to understand what is driving them to get to that point where they actually go hard enough on how they express themselves to the point where it becomes abuse.
That's a really scary thought. It's a very important point, and it needs to be done. And I understand why a lot of people don't do it. So if I were to take physical abuse for an example,
Yeah.
and whether it's 2 months into my marriage or 20 years into my marriage, the first time my husband lays a hand on me, I am so vulnerable, I'm so shocked, I'm so hurt, I'm so confused that perhaps the last thing I really want to do is, shame, I wonder what's driving that.
I agree. But that's not where we should have already raised alarm bells. Because remember, the violence becomes after the escalation of anger and frustration and rage. When we see that we're already getting to that point of frustration and serious disagreement, where things are escalating to points that are already concerning, that's where we already need to start understanding why it is that they feel so threatened, why do they feel so insignificant. And I'm not, again, making you responsible for how they feel. But in order to respond to resolve the right problem, we need to understand that we need to respond to the influences of what it is that's causing them to behave that way so that we can address their vulnerability rather than responding to the behavior. To respond to the behavior, you respond to the symptom.
Yes, I agree. So definitely take the time to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But my point is, right, I have seen far too many women stay in abusive relationships.
Yes.
You know, and it's because of fear, it's because society frowns upon divorced people, especially women. I personally
Absolutely.
think that women in Muslim societies bear the brunt of the stigma attached to divorce, right? And they bear the brunt of having to go through that almost isolated.
Yes.
Right? So for me, there is that thing of understanding, and I think that is part of your, I'm speaking now from the perspective of the abused woman, right? That is part of your journey to understanding what drove that, and perhaps you could catch it. So what we're wanting to do is have conversations with Muslim women to say, if these behaviors present themselves in this following way, maybe catch it before it gets worse and either have a conversation or, you know, get out.
Right.
But for a lot of women, that doesn't happen, right?
True.
It's a process, so it's not going to happen overnight. So currently, as we're speaking, there's so many women who are in the situation that they're being abused, they want to get out and they can't.
Yes, there's no easy answers to it. But I want us to park that for now and maybe deal with it in the second segment because that's a massive issue on its own.
Okay.
Getting to the point of tolerating that level of abuse and everything else, that has its own drawbacks and its own reasons for what is that gives us reason to want to compromise as much as we do, where we actually enable those cycles of abuse, right? But it's a complex issue, so let's not try to skim over it in this discussion.
Absolutely.
The other thing that I wanted to just draw the conversation back onto around divorce and getting to that point is that if you haven't established a good, healthy support structure with advisors that are balanced in the way they approach things, that are mature, chances are you're going to be surrounding yourself with people that are going to encourage you in your victim state. They're going to convince you that you are a victim. And whether you're a victim or not is not the question. How you're responding to what it is that you're a victim of is what the question is. And if they're going to encourage you to respond like a victim rather than to respond from a position of understanding and strength, they're part of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the biggest reasons why marriages fail, in my opinion, is not because of the couple's incompatibility. It's because of the failing of the support structures for the couples.
Absolutely. I agree. I think, you know, at a time like this, when people are at the most vulnerable in their relationship, it behooves society actually to really put their best foot forward and come and rally around a couple. I mean, we live in a society that's supposed to be that, right? We're supposed to be a community that actually wants the best for each other. And if we are just treating that person in their victim state, making them believe they're the victim and just drive things to their illogical end, are we actually serving our community in the best way that we're supposed to as Muslims?
Good question. And this opens up a whole can of worms on its own as well, because the one thought that comes to mind is that when a marriage fails, it's not just a failure of that relationship, it's a failure of the support structures around that relationship. So when we talk about wanting to marry a divorcee because of the stigma that we've now got attached to it, what we need to understand also is that when we consider that, we need to also be sure that we understand what we're getting into as far as the support structure is of the person that was previously in a divorce.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what we're going to be dealing with when we marry. Because you need that support structure to provide that balance and to provide that common ground of understanding, so that when things get emotional between the couple, that they have advisors they can trust to keep them on the steady course that they need to be on for the marriage.
So let's talk about these support structures, right? So a marriage has reached the point now where you're deciding, do I call it quits or do I try and fight?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of support, in your view, is important there?
I think this is, if there was truth to that statement that I like to make often, is you need to choose your advisors carefully. If you're not willing to see your support structure for who they are, and I'm talking of both sides, you need to see your partner's support structure, and that includes their family, their immediate family, or even their friends and social circles, wherever it is that they rely on for support and rely on for advice and guidance. You need to see them for who they are and whether or not they are contributing to the problem or are they actually helping to resolve the problem. And the same thing is absolutely true about your own family and your own support structures. Now, if you don't have the emotional maturity to be able to do that because you feel almost as if you owe your support structure loyalty before you owe your partner loyalty, then you've already got a problem.
Yes. So I see a lot of times before when I hear client stories and what brought them to that point, there is a lot of narrative around, and so my mother said, and my brother said, and my family said, and I wait for, and so what did your wife say?
Yes.
What did your husband say? And then I find that all these conversations are happening independent of the other person.
Yep.
So you're now taking your marriage, which is so personal, and you're discussing it with people who really aren't there experiencing it on the coalface. Even if I call my mother every day and tell her absolutely everything my spouse did to me, right, or did with me or said to me, that doesn't mean that she knows my marriage.
Yes.
But we assume that those people know our marriages better than the person that we're married to.
They only know your side of the marriage.
And they will empathize with my side. If it's my family, I can tell you, they'll be out there with torches ready to burn people down, right? And we find that often.
Yes.
That happens.
And this is exactly why you need to choose your advisors carefully. Are you looking for someone that's going to support you in your position? Or are you looking for someone that's going to help you to create understanding so that you can resolve the problem you're facing?
Such a key differentiation. For the people that are watching, if you take anything away from today's discussion, let it be that. Please always sense check. There are a lot of people who are staying in marriages that should not be happening, and there are a lot of people who are getting out of marriages that could have been salvaged. And all it is just making sure that you are making a well-informed decision and you are asking the right questions.
Yes, to the right people.
Yes, to the right people. On that note, thank you so much for joining us, and inshallah we'll see you in our second episode. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi.